thank you everyone for joining that event on the US policy toward the Indo-Pacific, and of course the convergences between France and the US ahead of President Macron's state visit to DC will be on December the 1st. I will let Michael with some introductory remark from the US Embassy. Then I will give you some housekeeping remarks and details. And then, of course, we are more than glad that I will introduce you in a few minutes, Lisa, to have you tonight as the guest speaker. You are one of the best experts of the Indo-Pacific in the US with more than 20 years of US government experience. So we're more than glad to have you. And of course, Mathieu, but I will come back to you very soon. So please, Michael.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to make remarks because I think we've got two amazing experts in this room that I think everyone is dying to listen to. All I will say is, Antoine, thank you very much for hosting this seminar. It is always a pleasure to partner with the Foundation for Strategic Research. And you've given us tonight this wonderful opportunity to better understand the American perspective on the Indo-Pacific and where they may converge with France's view on the Indo-Pacific. So I think there's a lot to get to. So back to you, Antoine, and to you, Lisa. Welcome.
Thank you very much so once again, the idea of tonight is mostly to raise awareness about the US foreign policy, to explore convergences, synergies, and maybe to get some fresh ideas that could be offered or suggested to the French president ahead of the state visit. So Lisa, we are more than happy to have you here tonight. You used to work at the National Security Council in charge of the Indo-Pacific, among others, and right now you are a senior fellow and the director of the program of Indo-Pacific Security at the Center of National American Security. So we are more than glad once again to have you. You've worked within the US government agencies, the CIA, in the State Department, at the National Security Council, and also I would say you're one of the best in the US and the most experienced in the US. You worked directly on the drafting of the Indo-Pacific strategy of the US government. It was, if I remember well, published in 2017. So we will give you maybe 15 to 20 minutes to start the kind of with introductory remarks, your view on the US strategy, and maybe to end with the convergence you might see with France. Then we will start a discussion between you and Mathieu and I. So Mathieu is a career diplomat. He freshly arrived in DC a few weeks ago. He's working at the CSIS, at the Russia, Europe, and Eurasia program, if I remember well. So you're one of the French in town in DC. So once again, I think it will be great to have your insight. And then in the second part, we'll have Q&A and interaction with IHEDN Jeunes that will, of course, interact, ask questions, and of course also moderate the very many questions you may have. So feel free to write down your question in the chat. We will discuss them in the second part, third part actually of the conference, but keep asking questions and we will make sure to answer all of them. Once again, Lisa, thank you very much for being here, and I'll let you start.
Well, thank you so much, Antoine, and thank you to the Foundation for Strategic Research for inviting me here today. It's certainly a pleasure to speak with you today. So certainly this region, the Indo-Pacific region, has emerged as the world's economic and geopolitical center of gravity. It encompasses 60% of the world's population, 35% of the world's GDP, and it's certainly a driver of the world economy. And it's become the central theater in the competition between the United States and China, and it will shape the future course of the 21st century. The Biden administration has been focusing on shoring up alliances and partnerships in this vital region to enhance deterrence, to prevent conflict, and maintain the free and open seaways of the region. Washington has been forging overlapping networks of partnerships, alliances, and multilateral groupings to help bring about a stable regional order. And these partnerships are certainly catalyzing cooperation to deal with challenges like maritime aggression, gray zone activity, preventing the misuse of technology for authoritarian purposes, and fulfilling the region's vast infrastructure needs. The White House Indo-Pacific Strategy that was released on February 11th lays out a blueprint for the United States to work with allies and partners in this region. And as you mentioned, I had worked on the Indo-Pacific Strategic Framework, which was the Trump administration's strategy for the region. And I think you can see a lot of similarities between the two, fundamental concepts and goals of these two strategies, if you compare them side by side. Of course, Trump's strategic framework for the region was initially a classified document that was declassified in January of 2021, shortly before Trump left office. So you can find that on the internet and compare these two strategies. So the Biden strategy is forthright about the threats and challenges posed by a rising China, a China that continues to circumvent global norms and rules, that continues to employ economic coercion for geopolitical gain, and that engages in increasingly aggressive military behavior in the region. But the strategy also focuses on an affirmative U.S. agenda with the goal of sustaining the region's free, open, transparent, and inclusive order. The strategy makes clear that the U.S. will remain firmly anchored in the region and work closely with allies and partners to further stability and prosperity. So there are a few main objectives of the strategy. I'll talk about a few of these. The first objective is, of course, to advance a free and open Indo-Pacific. And what this really means is to protect the sovereignty and independence of the nations in the region. And the second objective is about building connections within and beyond the region. And I want to talk about three main groupings here that the U.S. is referring to. The first is the Quad, the second is ASEAN, and the third is the European Union. So let me first talk about the Quad. Of course, the elevation and expansion of the Quad, this is US, India, Australia, Japan. I think what we have seen over the last 2 years has been nothing short of remarkable. Of course, the Quad was revived in 2017 after laying dormant for about 10 years. But I think, even I could not have foreseen how far the Quad would develop in just 5 years' time after its revival. It's been truly remarkable. It's not a military pact, but it is asserting a shared vision for an open and free region. And the Quad is focusing on strategic issues, not necessarily security or defense issues, but strategic issues like emerging and critical technologies, infrastructure development, cybersecurity, and other areas. And what the Indo-Pacific strategy says about the Quad is that it would like to see it evolve into a premier regional grouping. And so certainly the Quad will help promote a liberal order in the Indo-Pacific and help to deter conflict and advance prosperity. Secondly, I'll mention ASEAN as another critical grouping that the U.S. is working with in the region. Of course, President Biden just held his third summit with ASEAN leaders this past weekend in Cambodia. He emphasized that the U.S. wanted to assist the region in dealing with challenges that were occurring because of climate change, because of Russia's war in Ukraine. And they agreed to elevate the U.S.-ASEAN partnership to a comprehensive strategic partnership. And they announced 5 new areas for dialogue: health, transportation, to include a new electric vehicle initiative, women's empowerment, environment, climate, and energy. And the third grouping I wanted to mention is the European Union. And here I think we see one of the major areas for cooperation between the US and the EU is on infrastructure. We had the recent announcement of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment at the G7, and this coincides with the EU's Global Gateway Initiative. There are vast infrastructure needs in this region, and there's a need for investment alternatives to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I would just like to mention that the Center for New American Security recently released a major report titled Competitive Connectivity, Crafting Transatlantic Responses to China's BRI. And in that report, we present 3 potential future scenarios for how BRI might evolve in the next several years. One alternative is that China revives the BRI and refocuses it on critical and digital infrastructure. The second alternative is that some of the partner countries pursue selective decoupling from China in high-risk areas like critical and digital infrastructure. And then the third alternative is that China actually moves toward higher standards for its BRI investments, that it listens to some of the criticisms that have been made of the BRI in the last several years and responds to that and adopts a less confrontational posture and takes steps to reduce things like environmental impacts and labor and governance concerns that have been plaguing BRI projects. So we sort of lay out 3 different scenarios for how the BRI could go in the future. And then we make several policy recommendations for the United States and Europe to consider to address some of the challenges that we see. Some of these recommendations include wargaming China's economic tools of coercion, including examining the security risks with smart infrastructure and green technology that we're starting to become aware of. Second is creating a global consortium to support journalists and research organizations that conduct fact-based inquiries on BRI projects locally, so that there's sort of a compendium of fact-based inquiries on these projects. The third is establishing an EU rapid response fund to prevent China's exploitation of weakened economies, and that could be mobilized to provide alternatives to potential PRI investments that are deemed problematic. And fourth, we recommend considering developing a collective response to Chinese economic coercion. And this is in the spirit of NATO's Article 5, all for one, one for all concept, but applying that to Chinese economic coercion. So these are some of the ideas that we propose in our paper. So getting back to the Indo-Pacific strategy, the third major plank of the strategy is to drive regional prosperity. And it was very good to see the launch of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework in May. And then, of course, the first ministerial meeting of the IPEF in Los Angeles in September. So the IPEF is made up of 14 nations, including the United States, that represent 40% of global GDP. They have included 4 main pillars of engagement in IPEF: trade, which includes digital trade, clean economy, resilient supply chains, and fair economy, which would deal with taxes and corruption. So there are still several questions about the IPEF, and I think countries are still trying to gauge what tangible benefits may come out of the IPEF. I think countries are happy to see the U.S. engaging economically in the region, but there's still a good degree of skepticism on what IPEF may produce. And of course, the regional countries want to see discussions move toward market access. But I still think it's a question whether we will actually see that happening. So the jury's out on, what the results of IPEF will actually be. The fourth objective of the Indo-Pacific strategy is bolstering Indo-Pacific security. And this is about working with allies and partners to deter Chinese aggression, which has certainly taken on greater importance after China's provocative military drills in the Taiwan Strait in August. But it's also about China's increasing reliance on so-called gray zone activities that are seeking to enhance China's influence and undermine some of the traditional roles and impacts of democratic nations like the United States and France. These gray zone activities are not new. In 2012, Beijing effectively captured the disputed Scarborough Shoal with Chinese maritime surveillance vessels and has maintained a Coast Guard presence there ever since. And more recently, the Philippines lodged a diplomatic protest in 2021 when China docked over 200 fishing vessels near the Whitsun Reef in the disputed Spratly Islands. Manila claimed the vessels were part of a maritime militia China was using to try to take over the disputed maritime feature. So to meet these concerns about Chinese construction and militarization of artificial islands, as well as other activities that China is pursuing in terms of maritime aggression, the United States has increased the number of freedom of navigation operations it conducts, the so-called FONOPs. These, of course, are designed to challenge unlawful and sweeping maritime claims that are inconsistent with customary international law. This is a significant tool that the United States can use, and I think the U.S. must consider ways it can work with partners like France further in these efforts to challenge China's efforts to restrict and disrupt freedom of the seaways. So while the defining national security issue for the United States is strategic competition with China, Washington does not have the luxury of choosing whether it will stand up to either Russian or Chinese aggression. To preserve a rules-based global order where countries are able to preserve their sovereignty and independence, I believe the United States must work with like-minded partners and allies in both regions to meet the challenges from both Russia and China. Now, I bring this up because some in the United States are arguing that Europe must take care of its own region and that the U.S. should focus the majority of its resources and energy in countering China. And I would disagree with this notion. I think Russia and China represent different sides of the same ideological coin. There are authoritarian regimes that seek to rewrite the global rules in their own favor. Now, of course, the threat from Russia is more immediate, and this certainly comes out in the Biden administration's national security strategy. China seen more as a long-term threat and concern. But I just firmly believe that the U.S. has to be able to walk and chew gum and deal with both of these challenges at the same time. Now, I'm sure we're going to hear more from our other guest on France's Indo-Pacific strategy. I will note that it contains four main pillars: security and defense, economics, connectivity, research and innovation, multilateralism and rule of law, climate change, biodiversity, sustainable management of oceans. These are all things that really converge with the U.S. strategy in the region. So there is enormous scope for cooperation between the United States and France, and particularly in the Indian Ocean region. France plays a special role in this region, and of course, it joined the Indian Ocean Rim Association or IORA, as it's called, in 2020. So I think there's enormous scope for continued cooperation and greater cooperation between the US and France. So I'll just stop there. I look forward to your questions, and it's just a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The mic is on. That's fine. Thank you very much. Maybe let's start with Mathieu, because I know that you wanted to bring Lisa on the Indian Ocean. So I will let you start as a follow-up to what was said. And thank you so much, Lisa, because it was very not only interesting, but very useful to basically be able to contextualize the US Indo-Pacific strategy. So we can then move on to the potential of cooperation. So Mathieu?
Yes, let me thank you first, Antoine, for having me and for the FRS. I think it's a great pleasure and honor for me. I think it's a very timely discussions, of course, ahead of the state visit. But it's also, I think, very important that our two countries have the ability to talk more on the Indo-Pacific, because there have been some obvious misunderstandings in the past, but I think there is still room for more coordination and cooperation. So indeed, maybe I will start with the ends of your remarks, Lisa, and thank you for this very insightful introductory presentation. And indeed, in the Indian Ocean, I mean, we have, let's not say a divergence between the US and France, but a different definition of what the Indo-Pacific is, because the US definition of Indo-Pacific stretches from the western coast of India up to western coast of America. Some call it the Bollywood to Hollywood, whereas the French vision is closer to that of Japan or India and goes up to the Eastern African shores. And it's not that we have a broader means than the US to have such a broad vision, but it's really related to the overseas territories that we have in southwestern Indian Ocean. But also because we've invested a lot with our European partners to secure Northern Indian Ocean, because it is a vital sea lane of communication for Europe. You have Operation Atalanta under the EU flag. You have the Operation Maso with other European partners in the Persian Gulf. And so, yes, I'd be curious in a nutshell to have the vision, I mean, your perspective on how the US tackle this region, because we see that the Africa and Middle East are, maybe, if I can say so, the first victims of the pivot to Asia. I think it's quite clear in the national security strategy and the national defense strategy that were recently adopted by the US. And at the same time, the main competitor, China, is investing a lot in this region. You have his base in Djibouti. There are talks about doing new things with UAE. You have dual use seaports being built in Eastern Africa. So my question is, how the US see this region, and maybe more specifically, do the US support its Indo-Pacific partners, let's say France, India, being, let's call them, caretakers for the region, or does it prefer to keep a closer eye to what's happening in this region?
Great, thank you. Yes, certainly there is concern about the inroads that China is making, first in the Indian Ocean region. This has been happening, over the last decade, and has really advanced, particularly in Sri Lanka. We all saw the reports about the Sri Lanka, or the Chinese surveillance vessel that docked in Hambantota port last month, or 6-7 weeks ago. And really, the Sri Lankan government did not want the Chinese vessel to come in. It recognized that India was, not happy with this and had protested pretty vehemently. But really, because China has the 99-year lease on this port, there wasn't much that Sri Lanka can do. So I think these are some of the downsides of the Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, Sri Lanka's economy has melted down in the last several months. It's not all due to the BRI, but some of these white elephant projects that the Sri Lankans had gotten involved in with the Chinese certainly have contributed to their problems. So I think it's this is a story that we can learn from in Sri Lanka, how not to get indebted to the Chinese and lose aspects of your sovereignty. And I think, India in the past has been reluctant to see other countries get involved in its region. But I think now that China's posing a real threat, there's more openness by India to cooperating with like-minded countries like the United States, like France, like maybe Australia and Japan, in order to provide these other South Asian countries alternatives in terms of infrastructure investment, and just to offset some of the growing Chinese influence. Also Nepal, China has been increasing its influence in Nepal. This is another South Asian nation. And Bangladesh also has an important role in the Indian Ocean region. So this is a very interesting concept of, maybe India, France, the US working more closely to establish that free and open seaways in the Indian Ocean region in particular. And then with regard to East Africa and this area, you rightly raised the military base that the Chinese have established in Djibouti as a major concern, and preventing that, from happening in other countries is extremely important. With regard to the UAE, I would mention the I2U2 dialogue that has started between India, Israel, the UAE, and the United States. Now, I think one of the major motivations behind that was to tap into the Abraham Accords between UAE and Israel and try to build that out. India has been particularly interested in that dialogue. But it also could be a way to assert that free and open vision and to maintain security stability in this Indian Ocean region. So, yeah, I think this is a particular area that's ripe for greater cooperation between France and the United States, but also bringing in critical countries like India, maybe Australia. Japan also has some interest in this region as well. So, yeah, I think that's a fruitful area to concentrate our efforts.
You mentioned a lot the key partners: India, Australia, Japan, etc. France, India, and Australia initiated a few years ago a trilateral that is focusing mostly on the Indian Ocean. A new trilateral was just announced at the margin of the United Nations General Assembly a few weeks ago between France, India, and the UAE. I mean, from the US perspective, how do you see the kind of unilateral formats? Do you think they can have added value? Do you think they are welcome? Do you think that's something that the US is willing to coordinate or cooperate with? How do you see basically the emerging, the flourishing in a way of all of this unilateral, and how could that fit either into the US strategy or more broadly into the US overall objectives in the region?
Yeah, I think this is the way of the future, these multiple minilateral groupings and different trilaterals. I think this is the way that we establish that open, stable order that we all want to see. And it is by fostering cooperation trilaterally, maybe quadrilaterally, maybe between 5-6 countries. But we should not be rigid in how we think about this. I don't think, we're not going to see an Indo-Pacific NATO, for example. I don't think we're going to have that kind of, very structured, very formal type of grouping. But what we can see is this networked, overlapping mini-laterals, trilaterals, et cetera, of like-minded nations that want to see the stable, open order continue. And so I think that really is the way of the future. So it's going to be a sort of flexible, evolving regional architecture that won't look like, the European architecture, for example. It's going to be much more ad hoc and flexible.
And you mentioned a lot, of course, and you started with it to mention the Quad. Many have been discussing the so-called Quad Plus with France, the UK, Canada joining the Quads. It's likely, unlikely, but why not France joining some of the working groups? Because part of the Quad, for those who are following us, there are a lot of working groups on some very key issues like climate change, vaccine, etc. Would you think it would be welcome for some countries to join these kind of working groups? Not the Quad per se, but some of the working groups of the Quad? Do you think that the US would be welcome? I know that some countries, Korea, others may have joined some of these working groups already. On the individual basis sometime in the past. But would you say this would be welcome to kind of open up the Quad on some of the working groups?
I think that is something that should be considered. I don't think there is interest by the Biden administration in expanding Quad membership. I think it will remain the Quad, and the countries want to focus on deepening the cooperation between the 4 countries. But you simply can't deal with some of the major issues that they're dealing with without bringing in other countries to dialogue on an issue-by-issue basis. So I think it will be important to have Quad Plus discussions where you bring in other countries who have a particular interest on whatever topic is being dealt with, whether it's infrastructure or public health or technology. I think technology is a big one. And we've seen the establishment of the Fab Four, whatever you would call them, of the 4 countries, US, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, looking at some of the important technology issues. So I think it is going to be important to expand some of the issues that the Quad has identified and bringing in other countries. And, I would see France being extremely important when it comes to maritime security. France has a very, active presence, as we've been talking about, with its deployments of air and sea assets in the Indian Ocean region, in the East Africa seaways. So I think that France will have to be part of that discussion on maritime security in particular. Of course, the most recent initiative, the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative, which was announced in May, is a start. This is about sharing commercially available satellite imagery with countries in Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, the Indian Ocean region, so that these countries can start developing a common operating picture and can monitor their own territorial seas and EEZs better. So I would think France would have a role to play in this effort, in particular in that Indian Ocean region.
Mathieu?
Yes, I was happy, Lisa, that you mentioned in your remarks the debate here in the US, which I think for a Frenchman in Washington is very interesting to follow. But let's say division of labor, where the Europeans should take care of their backyard and the US move their assets from Europe to be all hands on deck on the Indo-Pacific. And I think there is some reason to this debate too, when we see the difficulties for the Europeans to ensure the security of their continent in the context of Ukraine. There is reasons to wonder: are we able to be overstretched and do even more in the Indo-Pacific? But then you also mentioned that the French Indo-Pacific strategy puts security and defense on top of its priorities. But I was also interested in hearing you mentioning the EU as the third grouping that the US would be interested in working with. But when you mentioned the EU and what it could bring you, first of all, you mentioned infrastructures and the fight against economic coercion. But then the question is, what could be the role of Europeans in terms of security and defense in the region? And here we have a question of vehicle that we need to discuss between Paris and Washington, because France has been, as you know, leading the effort for the European Union to be more involved in the region, but it also updated its national strategic
I think we lost Mathieu. Lisa, can you hear us? Yeah.
Yes, I can still hear you, but yeah, I think he froze.
Yeah, I think Mathieu froze. So it must be
its own Indo-Pacific agenda.
Sorry, we lost you for the last 15 seconds.
I'm sorry. No, I just said that the US has been pushing for NATO to have its own Indo-Pacific agenda. So how do we reconcile our differences of approaches between the role of EU, the role of NATO, the role of Europeans in the Indo-Pacific in terms of security and defense?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. The way I conceptualize it is, as I said, we're dealing with two authoritarian powers, Russia and China, that want to assert a vision for the future of the world order that is more favorable to them and their hegemonic designs and ambitions. And we've, of course, seen that play out with Russia very vividly over the last several months. And also, there's concern that we may see this with China more in the future in the Indo-Pacific. So I think our countries need to, see the situation for what it is and the reality, and that Russia and China have shown an interest in cooperating, maybe a little less so now that we've seen things play out in the Ukraine the way they have, and Russia has not been successful there. So that may have impacted China's thinking somewhat, but still we have that February 4th declaration, the Russia-China No Limits Partnership, which gives us an indication that there is some cooperation happening there, and they do see perhaps an opportunity to challenge the global order and do that together. So I think we do have to stick together in terms of how we are conceptualizing the challenge to the global world order. But we have to recognize that we have finite resources and defense resources that we have to be realistic about. And so we can't expect that, European countries are going to be putting a lot of military resources into the Indo-Pacific. But we still can expect help with diplomatic messaging and economic approaches to China, and helping to deter. My understanding, I was recently in Europe, and my understanding is that there is an interest by EU, European officials to contribute to that idea of deterring China. We don't want China to feel that it has an opportunity to unify Taiwan through military force. And so I think there's a recognition perhaps in Europe that they have a role to play in helping to deter China from considering such action. So that, that is what we should think about building upon. But I do think we have to be realistic when we talk about allocation of resources to different regions and what we can really expect. And that's why I was talking about things like, France and the US working together maybe on FONOPS and, other ways to leverage our resources together without an expectation that there's going to be, a major deployment of military resources from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. I don't think that's realistic.
Mathieu?
Yes, maybe I know you have a soft spot for India. You've been working a lot on India, and you have credit in the US for raising the level of the bilateral relation between India and the US. And as you know, France and India have been really strengthening their cooperation and partnership, and also because they are the two promoters of what they call strategic autonomy. We don't have exactly the same meaning, but this is something that also helps us being together. And I'm curious to know how the US perceives this rapprochement between New Delhi and Paris. Is it something that you think you're comfortable with, in the sense that the two countries are really eager also to tackle the Chinese challenge, but also is it something that you are kind of wary at, considering the strategic directions that these two countries promote?
So I think my concern would be that multipolar world means something a bit different to France and India than it does to China and Russia. I think, the concern is that China and Russia's idea of a multipolar world is one that they can assert their ideas, and being, authoritarian regimes, they have much different ideas than democracies like France and India to what that means, the multipolar world. So I think we have to be very careful in not allowing, the conception that France and India have for multipolarity, which is, rightly so. France and India are proud countries with, deep cultures and deep strengths that they bring. They have their strategic autonomy. And I think this, this is definitely something that's understood within the United States. But I think the problem arises when they start to associate too much with China's and Russia's ideas of what a multipolar world is, because that's much more antagonistic to the United States, and something that, seeks to undermine U.S. power and global influence. So I think, there's a fine line between multipolarity and how it benefits the overall, global order, and whether it contributes to stabilizing that order or destabilizing it. So I think that's where we see the difference. And in India's case, thank you for your kind words. I have devoted the greater part of my career to promoting the U.S.-India strategic partnership, and was very proud of the work that we did during the Trump administration to elevate that relationship. But I think that the differences with India over its approach to Russia have become exacerbated following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And, things that we could sort of brush aside in terms of India's dependence on Russian military equipment, now it's a bit more difficult, frankly. And so I think, we are hoping to see India gradually reduce its dependence on Russia. And I think that's in India's own interest, because as Russia comes under Western sanctions, particularly on its technology, it's not going to be a reliable partner for India. And with regard to India's problems with China on its border, the kind of border tensions that we saw, the crisis that we saw between India and China in the summer of 2020, something like that could happen again, of course. But India sees it as, they cannot afford to alienate Russia because they've got, severe problems with China on their border. And China's got this very close relationship with Pakistan. So the last thing India wants is to see a Russia-China-Pakistan alliance arrayed against it. So there's some understanding for that concern in India. But at the same time, India is not going to be able to count on Russia as Russia becomes more dependent on China. As Russia becomes more isolated from the West, it's going to look increasingly to China and will be more beholden to China, which means it'll be a less reliable partner to India. So this is something India has to work out as it moves forward. But it's a shifting, the landscape is shifting for India. And I think India is seeking to, protect its national security. But, in my view, I think over the long term, India's best bet is to work more closely with Western countries like the United States, like France and others, because Russia just is not going to be reliable for India. That's my viewpoint.
As a follow-up, what would you make of the consequences of the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia in the Indo-Pacific? Of course, huge consequences for Europe, indeed. What would be for you the main consequences of the war in Ukraine in the Indo-Pacific? Does it mean that there has been a shift in Indo-Pacific countries on Russia? Would you say that they are mostly affected by maybe energy security, food insecurity? But so what are the main impacts that you would see of the war in Ukraine or in the region?
Well, I think what we have seen is that the kind of cooperation between the United States and Europe, the coalescing of that relationship, and Russia's military failure, the Ukrainians being able to hold their own to a large extent, maybe has given China some pause, or at least would have to factor in some different aspects that it maybe had overlooked. Things like, the political will of the people themselves. And of course, U.S. military support for the Ukrainians has also been critical. So I think that the overall impact, we're still seeing it play out, quite frankly. But so far, I think it would have to give China some pause in thinking about how it moves forward with its goals vis-a-vis Taiwan. And, I credit European leadership for, being clear with China that the degree to which China supports Russia would impact trade and economic ties between Europe and China. I think that point was made early on by European leaders, and also, has made China think twice about what the impact could be on its economic relations with Europe were it to try to take Taiwan by force.
Okay, Mathieu?
Yes, well, I think it's quite fascinating. It's been 15 minutes we're talking, and we haven't mentioned AUKUS yet, and it's and it's not even in the Q&A so far.
You see the French official. I mean, you official a day, you official. I mean, till the end. I mean, you.
Oh, well, I guess it's a sign that some water has passed under the bridge, and I think this is also one of the what is expected of the state visit. Let's see how this issue will be tackled then. But actually, my question is not on AUKUS, but more on the South Pacific in general, because of course AUKUS has changed the landscape there, and especially our cooperation with Australia, which is now on better grounds. And it's really striking to me, considering the extent of common interests and of common assets that we have in this region, because US and France are the two Western residence power. We both have permanent military presence there. We have the two major EEZs in the region, and yet cooperation between France and US is very, very poor in this region. And of course, AUKUS did. I mean, it really made impossible the opportunity to evolve on this track for, let's say, a couple of months. But now there's probably more room to do more in the South Pacific. So I'm curious to know if you see specific avenues for cooperation in that region.
Well, since you raised AUKUS, I would just say that it seems to me that the major concern in France was the US not consulting on such a major issue in the Indo-Pacific when France is a major player in this region. And so I think, there's been recognition in the United States that perhaps it wasn't handled in the best way possible, which it's unfortunate, because I do think that AUKUS is about deterring China, and it demonstrates that the U.S. recognizes it cannot deal with the China challenge alone, that it needs to empower partners and allies with the capabilities they need that can also help in deterring China. And so that's what AUKUS is really about. But I do think that the US could have handled the rollout of AUKUS much better. And that certainly was a setback for US-France relations for a period. But like you said, hopefully we have overcome that. And now people are looking ahead to the future, ways that the US and France can cooperate. And I'm hopeful that in the upcoming visit, in President Macron's visit to Washington, D.C., that perhaps there will be more discussions on US-France cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And I think the Pacific Islands, you raised the South Pacific as an area where potentially there could be some cooperation. I think this is a good idea. One of the major issues plaguing this region, of course, is climate change. I think all conversations that one has with this region, that is predominant. They're extremely worried about what's happening with climate change. So perhaps that's an area where US and France can catalyze some cooperation. And the maritime security, that's another area that I think we could look at for more cooperation, because it's a fact that China is definitely making inroads there. And this is, even though these are, smaller countries, they cover a vast area of the ocean. And it's an area that we need to remain engaged in. And so there has definitely been recognition on that point. And I think we can expect to see more engagement, more visits, more initiatives. One of the major initiatives that we've seen is the US, Australia, Japan cooperation on subsea cables in this region, and working together to make sure that China is not dominating the subsea cables that are helping to power the digital life of these countries. So yeah, I think there's great scope for more cooperation between the US and France. And, I guess one question I would have for you, Mathieu, is what do you think France is prepared to bring to the table when it comes to the Pacific Islands? Do you think there's a lot of willingness on the French government's part to put more resources and attention on this particular region?
Definitely, yes. There has been some announcements, including the last Shangri-La dialogue by our Minister of Armed Forces. But what is interesting is that I would say South Pacific is still remain mostly tackled as a domestic issue somehow, because we have our overseas territories there, and the means that will be allocated there are mostly for what we call in France state action at sea. So it's basically taking care of our approaches. So it's not the grand strategic vision that we don't have a dedicated strategy for South Pacific. It's tackled within the broader Indo-Pacific strategy, but I know, for example, US, but also UK, Japan, Indonesia have their own South Pacific strategy. We don't have such thing, also because this is a sensitive issues. We have had to deal with the Statute of New Caledonia, for instance. So we're still working on eggshells in this region. But to answer that, there is definitely a willingness to allocate more means to re-engage with the region. It already started. We made sure in 2016 that French Polynesia and New Caledonia would join the Pacific Island Forum, so they are able to speak on their own there. And so, yes, this is definitely an area where we want to do more. And so this is also why I thought that there would be room for more cooperation with the US and the other main partners.
And if I can follow up, I mean, France is kind of unique among Europeans in the South Pacific. We have 3 embassies in Fiji, in Vanuatu, and in PNG, Papua New Guinea. When the Germans are just about to appoint an ambassador for the Pacific, so we do have a presence. Within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, actually, the Bureau of Oceania was elevated to a sub-directorate, to the same level as South Asia, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia. So I think there is really a willingness on the French side to do more, including through very concrete initiative. The Kiwa initiative is something that the French Development Agency is kind of very proud. It was a French initiative announced by President Macron in 2017 that started to be implemented in 2020, that is co-funded by Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the EU. That is basically working on biodiversity in the Pacific. And I'm sure there are so many more initiatives. But before getting the 2 people from IHEDN Jeunes to join me, I would just have one question for you, Lisa, very brief. If you were to advise or meet President Macron in Washington, what would be the key advice you would give him, key recommendation to foster US-France cooperation in the region? I know it's a tricky question. I know it's a very tricky question, but
well, I think that perhaps bringing a specific initiative that France would like to propose linking in with the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy would be a great way to kick off the cooperation. So I guess my advice would be that bring something very specific that the U.S. and France can announce when he comes to Washington, D.C., to really show that both countries are committed to working together in this region and spotlighting the special role that France has in this region. I think that will help to overcome the AUKUS, the troubles over AUKUS, and will really show both countries' commitment to working together. But yeah, being specific, rather than just kind of a general statement. I think having a specific initiative that the two countries can, have a working group, or, somehow show that they're actually doing something together. They're cooperating together to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific. That would be my advice. Mathieu might have.
I'm still here. I promise I'm still here. I'm listening. But I moved to make sure that the two young people from IHEDN could join. I will let you introduce yourself, and then of course ask your question to Lida, also check the Q&A, etc.
Hello, Mrs. Curtis. It's an honor to be with you. My name is Tristan, and I'm here with Paul to represent the IHEDN Youth Association. So we will proceed to the Q&A part. And for all the viewers, please don't forget to ask your questions in English. Thank you. You've explained that establishing partnerships in Indo-Pacific was one of the main goals of the US. Is the influence of the US threatened by the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership launched by China on the 1st January 2022, which increased the economic interdependence of countries in their area and includes AUKUS and Quad countries? I think about Japan, India, Australia.
I'm sorry, this was the, what was the Chinese initiative? You said it was January 2022. You're not talking about the...
Yeah, the RCEP. Regional, wait, yes.
Okay, got it. Yes, look, I think that this is a big problem that the United States did not join the TPP, which of course is now the CPTPP, Comprehensive Partnership. This was a major problem, and China, stole a march, I think, on the United States by promoting RCEP. But the United States is to blame. I think the United States, by withdrawing, from this major economic initiative, sort of paved the way for China to lead the RCEP initiative. So, it's a frustrating issue because it's become a very politically fraught issue on both sides of the aisle, both for Republicans and Democrats, that the issue of promoting global trade or free trade has become tied up with the issue of the U.S. worker and not disadvantaging the U.S. worker. And so until we have a U.S. leader that will, demonstrate to the U.S. worker the benefits of global trade, I think this will continue to be a problem for the United States. And I think the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is a positive step. It's the U.S. is taking some action to engage economically with the region, but I think it's probably not enough. And that I think the countries in the region are looking for something more. They're looking for market access. And I don't think that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the way it's playing out, will be enough. So there were questions on whether maybe the U.S. would join TPP now that the midterms are over, but I don't see it happening, frankly. I think it's still a politically sensitive issue for the Biden administration. So I'm very skeptical that could happen. So I think this is a major problem. So maybe my second advice for President Macron would be to emphasize that the U.S. really needs to become more economically involved in this region and to join TPP, or to really demonstrate that it's still a leader in helping to set the rules of the road, because right now the U.S. has kind of written itself out of that role by not joining TPP and not leading something else to replace it. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good evening, Mrs. Curtis, Mr. Droin. Thank you for being with us. Maybe I wanted to come back a little bit on the Taiwan issue. We've talked about it, of course, but do you think that the aggression on Ukraine can teach us some lessons on how to deal with an aggressive invasion? And especially, is there a difference? Would there be a difference in case of a Republican administration in 2024, or what would be the evolutions concerning the difference between Republicans and Democrats on this issue, do you think?
Great. I can take a first stab, and then Mathieu, if you want to also. But on the issue of Republican versus Democratic position on Taiwan, I think on this issue there is broad bipartisan agreement, and the need to defend Taiwan. Interestingly, you had a wing of the Republican Party who was skeptical about providing military assistance to the Ukrainians. I think there are still some of that within the Republican Party, but my guess is that part of the party will be less vocal moving forward, because a lot of the very right-wing candidates who would be supportive of such a kind of disengagement or America First policies actually lost their seats and did not do well in the midterm election. So I think that part of the party will be less vocal. And in addition, now that we see the Russians have left Kherson, the Ukrainians are doing better, faring better, it's sort of a justification, or it shows that President Biden's policy on Ukraine is working. So I think there's less room for Republicans to criticize how the Biden administration is handling Ukraine. So that's Ukraine. On China, I think there's much more agreement between Republicans and Democrats about how serious the U.S. has to take the competition with China, and that we have to deter China from trying to unify Taiwan militarily. So I don't see a great deal of difference between the two. I think you'll see with the Republicans taking the House, which I don't think we know for sure yet, but we're pretty sure the Republicans will take the House of Representatives after these midterm elections, that you'll see a lot of activity on China. You'll see probably new legislation. They're talking about setting up a select committee that would provide oversight over the administration's China policies. So you're going to see, I think, a very active Congress on China in the coming months and years. And what we have learned, again, I would come back to how important it is for the US and Europe to work together, to be on the same page, to try to deter this kind of aggression. And then if it does occur, to work together on sanctions and to show that unity. in how we approach such aggression that basically disrupts the global order. So I think that's the best thing that we have learned, the importance of deterrence, because frankly, I think there were many people who didn't believe that Russia would invade Ukraine. But now there's recognition that we've got to take the threat that China poses to Taiwan seriously. And then second, if that aggression occurs, we simply have to close down ranks and act in coordination with one another. Otherwise, sanctions won't be successful.
Maybe if I can add to that, I think if I try to put myself in Chinese shoes, and I think there are things, lessons. I mean, there are things that were impressive with Ukraine, and some that were probably left the Chinese unimpressed. I think what probably impressed the Chinese is that when there is an asymmetry in forces, which is the case between Ukraine and Russia, obviously, you can mitigate this asymmetry when you have a strong resolve from the population and really a will to resist, and support from international backers to sustain this resistance. So I think that's probably one lesson, and also probably China, pretty much like Russia, didn't expect such united response and such resolve from the West and from Europeans. And so this is probably one lesson that the Chinese take, but probably to balance that, there are some things that probably would not affect China the same way it affects Russia, for instance, sanctions, because of course the Chinese economy is much more diversified and much less tied to, and decoupling is already happening. So if we were to adopt massive sanctions, it probably wouldn't impact China the same way it impacts Russia. And also probably what China would take out is that in the end, Europeans or the West did not intervene in Ukraine. And so although Joe Biden repeated 4 times that the US would protect Taiwan in case of an aggression, probably Beijing sees that Taiwan is it's a much harder place to defend than Ukraine, for instance, if the Europeans would have to. So, and it also, I guess, underlines the importance of the nuclear deterrent on both sides. The fact that Russia wouldn't cross the line, but also the fact that the Western wouldn't cross the Ukrainian lines, not to face a nuclear response. And I guess the nuclear deterrent is a major aspect in that regard.
So we have a question from Maximilian, who says, during the introduction, the intensification of cooperation between the US and ASEAN was mentioned. However, the Asian countries do not seem to really cooperate themselves on many issues concerning China. What are the prospects of cooperation between the Asian countries, especially regarding the security issues in the South China Sea? Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that. So I think that's definitely true. The ASEAN countries have often very different responses to China, as well as Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Whereas I think most of the ASEAN countries supported the UN resolution to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You had countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, abstaining from those votes. So definitely with regard to China, there is different interactions. The Philippines is a very important US ally. The Philippines has been very clear that if conflict were to break out in the Taiwan Strait, that the US could count on the Philippines for basing troops there, providing logistics, stockpiling. So the Philippines is an extremely important ally for the United States. You have countries like the Philippines or Indonesia, which is, a leader in ASEAN, but has a very strong economic relationship with China and is very wary of, having to choose sides. And so really tries to have good relations with China and with the United States, and is wary of any kind of U.S. military involvement in the region. Indonesia is one of the most skeptical countries of the Quad, for example, believing that the Quad actually could provoke or fuel tension between China and the United States. So you have different degrees of relationship with China among all the ASEAN countries. And then if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, you have countries like Cambodia and Laos, who have been, very open to BRI investments, and some questions about, how reliant they're becoming on China, particularly with the military base, naval base being established in Cambodia that has been brought up. Of course, the Cambodians are denying this, but it seems pretty clear that China has established that naval base. So I think, it is challenging, but I think that's why the U.S. has to rely on this positive vision for working with ASEAN, address what are the concerns of the ASEAN countries, whether it's climate change, infrastructure investment, what are the ASEAN countries looking for? And that's what the U.S. Can work with the ASEAN countries on. It's unclear how the ASEAN countries will respond to the Maritime Security Initiative. This is the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative that the U.S. announced in May. And this is a Quad initiative. And we haven't really seen whether the ASEAN countries will be receptive to that initiative. So yeah, I think the U.S. is going to have to look at the things that the ASEAN countries are interested in. And I think that we saw this just a few days ago when President Biden was there for the ASEAN summit and announcing things like the electric vehicle initiative. This is something that ASEAN countries would be very interested in. Countries like Indonesia, which has a lot of these mineral resources for electric vehicles. So yeah, I think there is a lot of scope for U.S. ASEAN cooperation, but it will have to not be focused on things that might provoke China. That will be out of bounds for most of the ASEAN nations. So the U.S. will have to tread carefully on that.
So I think this will be one of our final questions. Yes, so once again, I want to come back to some of the things we've touched upon. Maybe on the topic of AUKUS, I wanted to know whether because one of the main parts of the deal was about the nuclear propelled submarines, which was not a parameter from the original French deal. So does this represent a shift in the nuclear posture for technology transfer in the Indo-Pacific from the US? Because we see that President Biden has once again proclaimed a very restraint on nuclear proliferation. So I wanted to have some of your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, look, I think we really have to make the clear distinction that the nuclear powered submarines will not contribute to, Australia, nuclearizing. Australia has committed to its IAEA commitments. It's not going to start reprocessing nuclear fuel. So I think we have to make that separation. Just because these are nuclear powered submarines that will have, unique capabilities, they're more stealthy, they are at faster speeds, so they definitely enhance Australia's capabilities to be engaged in monitoring and preventing maritime aggression. So that's very important. But this has nothing to do with nuclear capabilities of Australia. And so I think there's that very clear distinction. And unfortunately, I think China has been pushing this disinformation campaign, trying to say, we're breaking nuclear taboos, and this is going to contribute to nuclear proliferation. So I think we have to push back against that Chinese disinformation. And then if there are, genuine concerns by countries, the US should be consulting closely with those countries. I know Indonesia has been raising concerns as well. I think Malaysia also, about whether it would contribute to nuclear proliferation. So the US needs to engage closely with these countries, explain why that's not the case, and explain how AUKUS is really about deterrence. This is about deterring maritime aggression, deterring China from taking military action against Taiwan, deterring China from engaging in more gray zone activities that threaten the sovereignty and independence of Southeast Asian nations. So AUKUS, is beneficial in that it's about deterrence. I think that's the message that the US needs to get out.
So thank you, everybody. Is there maybe a final comment that you would like to make, either Mr. Droin or Mrs. Curtis? Or both?
Go ahead, Mathieu.
No, nothing special to add on my side. I think I liked your advice of what you should recommend to President Macron when he comes to DC for his state visit. But apart from that, I would just like to thank you and to thank once again Antoine and the FRS for this very great discussion.
And I would like to add my thanks as well. It's been a great pleasure to engage. These were all excellent questions, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Yeah, I get the light on me, so thank you very much for joining, all of you. Online, and of course, Mathieu and Lisa, and I'm sure we'll have many more opportunities to keep discussing and making sure that we can foster and deepen cooperation between our two countries. Once again, thank you very much, and we'll get back to you soon. We'll get back to you soon with other events on the Indo-Pacific. So thank you very much. Have a good evening and good afternoon, Lisa. Thank you very much once again. Thank you.
Thank you.